branch. We will be recording tonight's webinar, and tonight's event is co-hosted by the Australian Jewish Historical Society and the Lamm Jewish Library. The Australian Jewish Historical Society of Victoria acknowledges the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we operate. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. It's my pleasure to introduce Ian Samuel. Ian is a committee member of the Australian Jewish Historical Society, and he's the Deputy Chair of the Lamm Jewish Library. And Ian will introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Henry Lew.
Thank you very much, Gavin. So on behalf of both the Lamm Jewish Library of Australia and the Australian Jewish Historical Society, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Henry Lew, who, as his bio tells us, is a retired ophthalmic surgeon. I think I've pronounced that almost correctly, who has spent both his time as a surgeon and subsequently writing a number of very interesting books on a wide range of subjects. His latest, Patterson of Israel, documents the story of a Protestant member of the Light Horse Brigade who served during the First World War in the Middle East and in particular in Palestine, and developed both a love of the country, love of Jews and a love of Zionism. So with that brief introduction, I hand it over to you, Harry, or Henry, depending on what day it is, to tell us more about it.
Okay, you can all hear me now? Yep. Look, I think it's a real privilege to be able to address everybody here today about the book Patterson of Israel, which highlights the most amazing, incredible life of John Henry Patterson, who is one of the most remarkable Christian figures the Jewish people have ever encountered on their way through all the centuries of the dispersion from 135 AD to the current day. And before you get overexcited about those comments I've just uttered, they're not my comments, they're Vladimir Jabotinsky's. So they do carry some weight. The obvious question then is, why has virtually no British person and no Jewish person ever heard of John Henry Patterson? When I ask people about him, certainly well less than 10% have ever heard of him. And the answer is quite simple. Victors create history, and victors write people out of history. And when it came to English history, Patterson was written out of it by General Allenby. When it came to Jewish history, he was written out of it by David Ben-Gurion. Now let me explain those points. General Allenby was an Arabist. He had no interest in a Jewish state in Palestine. He wanted an Arab state in Palestine. And he and his subordinates did everything possible to ensure that that happened. The other thing that he really wanted to happen was to be the British cover boy for World War I. And to that end, he got himself the American filmmaker Lowell Thomas, who some of us will remember we've seen on TV in the 1950s and 60s. And he gave Lowell Thomas a free rein to go with him in Palestine and with Lawrence in Arabia. And Thomas made a silent movie, as it was in those days, called With Allenby in Palestine and With Lawrence in Arabia. It was first shown in New York for about 6 or 8 months to millions of people. It was then shown in London for a further 6 to 8 months to millions of people, and then travelled through some of the European capitals. And it really made Allenby and Lawrence the cover boys for World War I. They didn't have terribly much competition in France because the British generals generally were not very successful in France. And at the time of the Russian Revolution and the communist takeover by Lenin and the closure of the Eastern Front, the British were very concerned that they could indeed lose the war in France. And if it wasn't for an Australian Jewish general called Monash, and if it wasn't for the Americans that came over, who were all expert baseball players, which made them very, very dangerous with the newly invented weapon, the hand grenade, because they could throw those hand grenades wherever they wanted to, the war in France might have been lost. So Allenby and Lawrence were the real figures that came out of the First World War, as far as the British public were concerned, and were their heroes of the First World War. And therefore they were in a position to bury the story of Patterson under the carpet. And if there was justice in the world, let me tell you that the Lawrence of Arabia story, which you saw filmed as the real truth in David Lean's Academy Award-winning film of that name, that 90% of that story is fiction. And Lawrence is on record as admitting it's fiction. And when you read the book, you'll come across that. And if there was justice in the world, everybody in 1962 who went to watch Lawrence of Arabia would have been watching a movie called Patterson of Israel, the title of this book. So that's the English side. Now, why the Jewish side? The Jewish side is because David Ben-Gurion hated Vladimir Jabotinsky with an incredible passion. He really hated him. I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but in 1933, at a meeting, the People's Meeting in Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion referred to Jabotinsky as Vladimir Hitler. And that same year, he wrote a pamphlet which he named Jabotinsky in the Footsteps of Hitler. Now, Jabotinsky did something very convenient for Ben-Gurion. He died in 1940. And so he wasn't there to contest the prime ministership. But you never know, had Jabotinsky survived, he might have been the first prime minister of Israel or the first president, and maybe not, and Weizmann, he might have been the first president, Weizmann might have been the first prime minister. But the facts of the matter are that when Jabotinsky died in New York, you had a situation where he had a will that stated that he wants to be buried where he dies. But when there is a future Jewish state in Israel, he wants to be buried in that state at the request of the Jewish government there. And the minute Ben-Gurion was elected prime minister, person after person came and asked for Jabotinsky's bones to be buried in Israel. And Ben-Gurion's standard answer was no, Israel is for living people, not dead people. Now, Ben-Gurion was effectively in power from 1948 to 1963. He had a year and a bit of absence in 54 and 55 when Moshe Sharet was the acting, or if you like, the temporary prime minister. But it's interesting that during the 15 years that Ben-Gurion was in power, the number of people who approached him actually included Moshe Sharet, who was the Prime Minister in 54-55, and he was also requested by Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who is still Israel's longest serving president and was president for most of the years that Ben-Gurion was Prime Minister. He also requested, can we please bury Jabotinsky's bones in Israel? But Ben-Gurion was persistent and no, and Jabotinsky's remains were eventually buried in Israel in 1964, because as soon as Levi Eshkol became Prime Minister, and remember he was in the same party as Ben-Gurion, he gave permission for Jabotinsky's bones to be taken to Israel and to be buried there. And if you buried Jabotinsky, you had to bury Patterson, because if you had met the two men in New York and you had gone up to Jabotinsky and said, who is your best friend in the whole world? He would have told you John Henry Patterson. And if you went up to Patterson and asked him who was his best friend in the whole world, he would have said Vladimir Jabotinsky. So Ben-Gurion created a fiction, if you like, during his reign, that the godfather of the Israeli army was Ord Wingate. Wingate was there in the late 30s. He took some young Palmachniks. He taught them, he was very concerned that the Arabs were conducting night raids on Jewish settlements during that Arab revolt of 1936 to 1939. And what he did was he said to these young Jewish boys, you should be going out on night raids before they come here. And when we come across them, we'll deal with them well away from our settlements. And so Wingate really taught these young people, people like Dayan, like Rabin, like Yigal Allon, he taught them how to be guerrilla fighters. But you've got to remember that when Wingate was in Palestine in, say, 1938, let us say, the men who had served under Patterson at Gallipoli and had served under him when they accompanied the Australian Light Horse in Palestine, these men were still only in their early 40s. You know, they were seasoned fighters who were now 40 years old. It wasn't as if there was nobody in Palestine at that time with no military experience. You know, the Patterson men from Gallipoli and Palestine, quite a number of them were there. And so, in fact, the true godfather of the Israeli army is John Henry Patterson. So this is why, I've just explained to you why, when at an old boys dinner, which we used to attend before COVID, about once a month, somebody asked the rest of the group, had they ever heard of John Henry Patterson? And only one other person in the group had ever heard of him. The person who asked the question had read a short story by Ernest Hemingway called The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. I don't know how many of you have read that book, but it tells of a safari in Africa. And on the safari, as well as the hunter or accompanying the hunter, are a husband and a wife. The wife convinces herself that her husband is a coward and uses this to have an affair with the hunter. And apparently the wife is very good at finding excuses with her husband as to why she should have affairs with somebody else, and she has a long history of this. On a subsequent day, when they go out on the hunt, they get attacked by a wild boar. The hunter says to the husband and wife, pick up your rifles and shoot the boar. The hunter picks up his rifle and shoots the boar. The husband picks up his rifle and shoots the boar, and the wife picks up the rifle and shoots the husband. And there then was a footnote to that story, that this story is based on true events which occurred in the life of John Henry Patterson, who commanded Jewish legions at Gallipoli and in Palestine during World War I. So one of the guys had discovered a Patterson from the footnote to Hemingway's story. Now, Patterson had a very significant military career in India, in Africa in the jungles, and also in South Africa during the Boer War. And he actually wrote a book called The Man-Eaters of Tsavo, which was one of the best-selling books, British books of the first half of the 20th century. And that book has indeed been made, or has had about 6 or 7 movies based on it. So Patterson, just for writing The Man-Eaters of Tsavo, is really quite an important historical figure. So much so that Theodore Roosevelt, then President of the United States, who himself was a big game hunter, invited Patterson on 2 occasions to visit him in the White House. And he actually visited Patterson in England when he visited there for Henry VII's funeral. And Patterson and Roosevelt were very good friends for life. So it wasn't as if this is a person with no previous form or no previous history. He's been deliberately written out by Allenby and by Ben-Gurion. If you read the book, you'll see the lengths to which Allenby went to actually create an anti-Semitic environment for the Jewish soldiers in Palestine. It's quite incredible. Patterson said there was none of that in Gallipoli, and there was none of that when he was serving alongside the Aussies. He said the Aussies were fantastic, but the British, Allenby and his subordinates, created a very, very strong anti-Semitic and cruel environment for the Jewish soldiers in Palestine. Allenby makes someone like Jeremy Corbyn look like a Philo-Semite. And it's an absolute disgrace, I think, that one of the main streets in Israel today, in Tel Aviv, is called Allenby Street. And there's actually a short chapter in the book where I make the suggestion that we change the name of Allenby Street to Patterson Street. Patterson got into trouble with the British Army after his hunting expedition in 1908, which was not quite the same as what Hemingway wrote, but he had a husband and wife on a safari he was conducting in Africa. The husband suicided, and Patterson was declared as having an affair with the wife. And because the husband was the son of the Lord and the wife was also very British upper crust, he found himself expelled from the British Army. And when he tried to re-enter the British Army in World War I, the only position he could get was when he took himself at his own cost to Egypt, was a job that nobody else in the British Army wanted to take on. There were thousands of young Russian Zionists who the Turks had expelled from Palestine on a never-to-return basis and who ended up in Egypt. And when Patterson arrived there, he was said, if you want a job, you've got 3 weeks to prepare these guys and make them into a mule train for the Gallipoli campaign, which he did. And he was so impressed with these guys that it made him a Zionist for the rest of his life. And you can read how that occurred, in the book in significant detail. So that when he finally left the British Army in 1920, he continued his pro-Zionist activities for the rest of his life. Also of interest, when I was hearing a little bit about him at the dinner on that Wednesday night, I couldn't understand, being an Australian-born Jew who had gone to school here and who every year got lectures on Anzac Day as to the history of Anzac Day, how nobody had ever mentioned Patterson and his Jewish mule train at Gallipoli. And so when I got home that evening, because one of the guys at the dinner had in fact heard of him and said he'd written a number of books, I went on to a second-hand book site, which I really like to go to, called Adall, and put Patterson in as the author. And in the world, there were one copy of two books available. One was called With the Zionists at Gallipoli, which Patterson wrote in 1916 and must be one of the first accounts of the Gallipoli campaign. And another one was With the Judeans in Palestine, which was published in 1922 and was one of the earliest accounts of the Palestine campaign. So when those books finally came, they were a godsend because they're very, very rare. They're very hard to get. I think now there are Indian companies that do reprints if you ask them. But at that time that I asked for the books, they were very, very rare, very hard to get. And what they did was they gave you his personal story of those two campaigns. And they were just absolutely amazing. And it was horrific to think that these two accounts had been buried under the carpet of history. And so I felt, somebody has to go and write a book and give him all the dues. When the war ended, about 1920, another thing that's, I suppose, very, very interesting, might be worth a mention, but if you want to know the chief anti-Semites, there's Allenby, Lieutenant General Louis Jean Bowles, who was his second in command, and a Colonel Bernie Harry Waters Taylor, who was Bowles's chief of staff. And are many of you familiar with the 1920 pogrom in Jerusalem at the Nabi Musa festival? Well, if you're not, Bertie Waters Taylor actually went to Haj Amin al-Husseini, who became the future Mufti of Jerusalem, and told him that he had a great opportunity at Easter to show the world that the local Arabs would not tolerate Jewish domination in Palestine. Waters Taylor furthermore explained to al-Husseini that Zionism was unpopular with the military administration, and that if the disturbances which might occur in Jerusalem at Easter were sufficiently violent, then both General Bowles and General Allenby would advocate the abandonment of the Jewish home. They wanted to reverse the Balfour Declaration. And I don't know how many of you at the meeting today have actually heard of the White Paper. But the White Paper was a paper published in 1939 whose aim it was to reverse the Balfour Declaration. It was from that wonderful government of that wonderful man called Neville Chamberlain, who went to Germany and said, "Peace in our time," with Adolf Hitler. And if you actually read Patterson, he actually refers to Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, and Neville Chamberlain as non-entities. And the Churchill, who finally came to power, was, the saviour. But look, I'd like to read you just a little thing. You'll understand why Ben Gurion could not promote Patterson if he hated Jabotinsky. And I just want to read you a little thing from the book, which Patterson is talking about Jabotinsky, and this is published in 1945. Jabotinsky was not a born soldier, not only by my standards, the standards of a man who has spent many years of his life in army service, but by any standard. Jabotinsky was, of course, a civilian. While in the Jewish Legion, he made an excellent soldier, as fine and brave, as disciplined and courageous as any other. However, no one who knew the man at all could possibly have missed those exceptional gifts of statesmanship, intellect, leadership and oratory with which he was endowed in such unparalleled abundance. It was too wonderful a combination to be restricted by any army uniform. If a Republic of Israel had existed, Jabotinsky would have made an ideal president. The Jewish Legion in World War I came into being primarily through Jabotinsky's vision and his stubborn determination not to rest until it had become a reality. Indeed, one could say that Jabotinsky was Israel's Winston Churchill. The parallel between the two men was truly striking. Churchill was for many decades the enfant terrible of British politics, exactly like Jabotinsky in Zionism. Both Vladimir Jabotinsky and Winston Churchill were great writers and famous orators. Both were civilians whose lives were coloured by military episodes and a deep interest in war problems. Both spent the major part of their lives in opposition. Both had the foresight and the prophetic power to foretell political events, and they both repeatedly warned their peoples in vain against the fatal policies of their mediocre leaders. This parallel is true even in details. When at a Zionist Congress, the word would spread that Jabotinsky was going to speak, there would be a stampede for seats. They would all listen, applaud and admire, and then they would vote for Weizmann and re-elect him to the leadership. The reaction to Churchill's speeches in the House of Commons was exactly the same. There too, a half-empty room would fill to capacity to listen to Winnie. They would give him a great cheer and they would walk into the division lobby to uphold Stanley Baldwin, Ramsay MacDonald, Neville Chamberlain or some other non-entity. Fortunately for Britain, this parallel did not proceed indefinitely. When confronted with a great catastrophe, the British nation obeyed its inherent healthy instinct and called to power its Jabotinsky, who was destined to lead Britain out of its dire peril to glorious victory. The Jewish people never did turn to its Churchill, even facing the most tragic disaster in its long and eventful history. It still left the reins in the hands of its old leaders. The Jewish Churchill was left to die in opposition. So you can see what Patterson thought of Jabotinsky. Now, it's interesting. I was talking at a place last week called the Non-Jewish Book Club, and one of the people who was actually sitting there put up his hand and said that his great uncle had actually been in the Jewish Legion and that he had been training in Plymouth and he met with Jacob Epstein, the sculptor, who was in the Jewish Legion, and also with David Ben-Gurion, who was in the Jewish Legion. And Patterson, in his memoirs, had actually mentioned Epstein, but said that Epstein, for some reason or another, withdrew and didn't actually go out to Egypt. So he was only there training for a short time and then withdrew. Ben-Gurion did go out. He went out, there were three divisions. They were called the 38th, 39th and 40th Royal Fusiliers. And Bean, who reported the First World War for the Australians in his famous book, he just used that term. He never mentioned that they were Jewish legions. They were just Royal Fusiliers. Patterson was in charge of the 38th and the three of them. The 39th had Eliezer Margolin in charge, who was a Russian Jew who emigrated to Australia, joined the Anzacs, fought with them at Gallipoli, and then transferred over to the Jewish Brigade. And it was the 38th and 39th that went out to Egypt. Ben Gurion was in the 39th, and the minute he got to Egypt, he suffered a very acute attack of dysentery and was hospitalised. So he didn't actually go with the 38th and 39th and conduct the war against the Turks. When he finally recovered from his dysentery, he joined the 40th, and the 40th didn't actually get to Palestine till the fighting was all over. So whereas Jabotinsky was actively involved in the Jewish Legion and all the fighting, and actually was awarded an MBE for his services in that respect, Ben Gurion was just in the 40th, which came later. The other interesting thing about Patterson was that when Jabotinsky stood up against some of the anti-Semitism that they were being exposed to, Allenby expelled him from Patterson's corps. This was when the fighting was all over. And at a later date, when he tried to, after he protected some Jewish people who were, when they had the pogrom in the old city of Jerusalem, the British at the time ordered all the gates closed, and Jabotinsky, who was leading a Jewish Defence Corps, wasn't allowed entry into the city. But because the Defence Corps was in the new city of Jerusalem, there were no pogroms in the new city, just in the old city. But as a result of that, the British authorities arrested Jabotinsky and they sentenced him to 15 years jail. Patterson by that time was back in England and was leading street demonstrations of thousands of people requesting Jabotinsky's release from prison, which he eventually got. And people like Churchill were in fact on his side at that time. So another thing that he was, both Weizmann and Jabotinsky approached him in 1920 when the United Israel Appeal was founded, or the Keren HaYesod as it was called, and they asked him if he would do a tour of 60 cities in the USA, in England, the UK, and also in Canada to raise money for the newly formed UIA. He did that. They gave him food, they gave him accommodation and fares, but he refused to take a salary or any other remuneration. And in the early years of the UIA, in the early 1920s, he raised millions of US dollars or its equivalent for the UIA. He continued to be involved in Zionistic affairs right up till his death. I'm not going to go in detail about the battles at Gallipoli or the battles in Palestine. I think they're best read in detail by reading the book. But you're all very familiar with Jonathan Netanyahu, the Jewish hero of Entebbe. And you know where the Jonathan comes from? He's named after his godfather, John Henry Patterson. So, you know, sort of Patterson was an integral part of the history of the Jewish people. Where he and Jabotinsky differed principally from Ben Gurion at the time was that Patterson and Jabotinsky both were of the belief that a Jewish state would only survive in Palestine if it had a stronger army than all the surrounding countries, whereas Ben Gurion wanted to rely on British help for the survival of the Israeli state. Should I stop there, or do you want me to keep on going?
No, I think.
I think. Are you happy to take some questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to take as many questions as you want to give me.
Yes. No, I think that's pretty good. Who's going to moderate? I thought.
Yeah,
yes,
I am.
Francis. Yes,
Hi,
if
Francis.
you would, thanks.
Thank you. I'm Francis. We ready? Okay, I'm Francis Prince. Thank you so much for that really, really interesting talk. The book and the amazing, it's obviously amazing depth of research that you've undertaken. I'm going to ask people questions in a moment. I just want to make two quick comments, if you don't mind. Where I have seen the name Patterson displayed is at a very, I don't know if it's strange, because it's strange, and interesting museum in Jerusalem. There's the Friends of Zion, Jerusalem, which is basically a Christian museum, and it's like thanking all these non-Jews who helped bring Israel into being, and it's well funded from the United States and so on. So he's got like there's a significant, I guess, dedication to him. And the other thing is, for those who know Jerusalem, in the suburb of the German colony off Emek Rephaim, there's all the side streets, one after the other, really small, some are large, are named after Christians who are seen again to have made a significant contribution and given support to Zionism. And Patterson Street, I don't know if there's another one anywhere else in Israel, there probably isn't. It's a very narrow, tiny street. If anyone's familiar with the New Orient Hotel at the Emek Rephaim sort of end, is this very small side street, and that is Patterson Street. So I don't know if it's much of a tribute, but there's something.
Can I say something about that? The Friends of Zion Museum is quite a new museum. What happened was around about 2010, Patterson's grandson approached the Israeli government and announced that Patterson had left in his will a request that when there was a Jewish state in Palestine, he would like his and his wife's remains dug up and buried in that state in a cemetery that contains the bodies of a number of the men who served under him. He wanted to be buried with his men. And that was granted in 2015, and the remains were brought, and they were buried in a place called Avihayil, which is near Netanya. And there's also a Patterson museum there. And that was a moshav that was founded after World War I by soldiers that had served under him in either the mule train at Gallipoli or the Legion in Palestine. Benjamin Netanyahu conducted the service and spoke. And if you Google YouTube, Patterson Netanyahu, you must have Patterson first, otherwise you'll get millions of YouTubes. You want YouTube Patterson Netanyahu, you can listen to the speech. Essentially what Netanyahu says is that the Jewish people have been a people that for many, many years, thousands of years, have had their own unique sense of idealism, which they have protected at all times. They were not going to allow their beliefs and their ideas to be altered by other people. And they therefore had quite a number of warriors in their history who protected these ideas. And it starts with Joshua, it goes to Gideon, it goes to King David, it goes to Judah Maccabee, it goes to Simon Bar Kokhba. And he said that once you had the dispersion in 135 AD, and the Jews were dispelled everywhere. The term warrior Jew was eventually replaced by wandering Jew and cowardly Jew. And Netanyahu said, and what John Henry Patterson did was he brought these Jews together once again for the first time in 2,000 years, made them into a proper army that had to fight in a proper war. And what he did was he restored the old tradition of warrior Jew. And Netanyahu then said, and it's for that reason that we have to call him the godfather of the Israeli army.
Thanks for that, Henry. Okay, questions from other people. There aren't any questions in the chat, but I'm happy if someone wants, who are comfortable.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, Sam.
Sam Mishinsky. Harry, thank you very much for a very informative account. And I say that as a former member of Beitar in Shanghai, where Beitar was the dominant youth movement. And of course, we all grew up in the shadow of the worship of Vladimir Jabotinsky. I must say that from my memory, I cannot recall any mention made of Patterson in our Beitar education. But my question to you is that in view of the many years, ironically, of the legacy of the revisionist movement in its many modern forms ruling Israel, and the ironic virtual eclipse of the very powerful Mapai party of David Ben-Gurion in the Israeli politics of today, have there been any attempts to redress this historical gap by the current Israeli government, which is in effect the inheritors of the revisionist movement founded by Vladimir Jabotinsky?
Well, I think it's under the current government that Patterson's remains were brought to Israel. It was a real ceremony. The country issued stamps to celebrate it. There's a Patterson Museum in Avihail, and there's now the one that Francis said, the Friends of Zion in Israel. So they are sort of, I think, readdressing it.
Well, thank you for that.
Thanks, Sam. And Howard, would you like to, Howard and then Ian, thank you.
Yes, Howard Freeman, Harry. Harry, would you care to tell us about the extraordinary relationship between Patterson and the Netanyahu family?
Oh, well, when he was in America in the late 30s, early 40s, Jabotinsky was also in America. They were there together. And Ben-Zion Netanyahu served as a while as Jabotinsky's secretary. And he was also the editor of the Zion News, which was a journal that was being produced in New York about once a month. And so Ben-Zion Netanyahu, through their mutual association with Jabotinsky, became a very close friend of Patterson's. And when his first son was born, he asked Patterson to be the godfather at the bris. And Patterson turned up with a silver tankard, which was engraved to my godson, Jonathan Netanyahu, from your godfather, John Henry Patterson. And in the book, in December 1942, that edition of Zion News actually had Patterson on the cover, celebrating his 75th birthday. So Patterson was always a major figure as far as the Netanyahu family was concerned.
Thank you for that. Ian, you're next. Ian Samuel. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, Henry, you spoke of Patterson and his wife. Did Patterson have any children?
Yes, yes.
And how do they figure in all of this?
He had one son.
Yep.
He had two other children. He met his wife either in India, I believe, or on a boat back from India. His wife was an extraordinary woman. She was the only woman in England to have a doctorate in laws. But because she was a woman in Victorian England, she couldn't practice law. So she did a Bachelor of Science as well and became a school teacher and a headmistress in India. So she was the only British woman with those dual university degrees. She was due to marry a doctor in India who died on their proposed wedding day from an infectious disease. She met Patterson subsequently. Patterson was quite a ladies' man, and by the time they got married shortly thereafter, she was already 3 months pregnant. When that baby was born, they lost the baby. They then had a second one, which they also lost. The first one was a girl, the second one was a boy. And then we go to that famous safari in Africa with the Lord and the Lady. After the safari was over, Patterson had to come back to London to face the House of Lords because initially he was accused of being a murderer and an adulterer. But people on the safari with him said that he was with them 400 metres away when the shots were fired. So it's very unlikely that he could have shot the guy. And then he came back. He was sharing a tent with Ethel Blythe, who was the lady's name. And then he came back with her to England. And about 8 or 9 months after they arrived in England, Patterson suddenly had a son. And nobody knows whether the son is actually Mrs. Patterson's son, who was already well into her 40s, or whether it's Ethel Blythe's son. There's no birth certificate, and the only birth certificates that can be found suggest that the mother's initials might be EB. But they don't say that the father's Patterson. They just say the father's an engineer, and Patterson had the equivalent of a university degree in engineering. The grandson was asked whether he thought, well, I suppose the situation that arises is that maybe Francie Patterson, being such an educated and intelligent woman, well into her 40s and perhaps barren, preferred to be one of the first advocates for surrogacy and was happier having a husband's child with another woman than no child at all. But the grandson was asked whether Lady Ethel Blythe, in his opinion, or Frances Patterson was his grandmother. And he said, well, to tell you the truth, it's of no consequence because either way I'm impeccably bred.
Gorgeous. Thank you.
That's fabulous. Sounds personality and a half in so many ways. Thank you. There's a question, I don't know if it's from Hillary or Bill Rubenstein, or Hillary and Bill Rubenstein together because they're sharing the screen. But the question is actually, follows up from what you've just been telling us. It's more about his background. I guess you've given us some part of his background, but I guess his upbringing, perhaps his family, his parents, his own education.
He was illegitimate, and he was thought to be the son of Irish Protestant landowners and one of their Catholic serving maids. But nobody knows who his real parents are. They know where he grew up because he grew up on an estate in a certain place in Ireland that had stables, and there was only one place in that little town of settlement that had stables, and that was the landed gentry, and I think they had 5 sons, all of whom were of siring age. So they don't know which one it was. And he lived there till he was 17 years old. He had a very good education, was very well read, and it was assumed that a lot of it may have been from books in a very significant library that was on that estate. And at the age of 17, he lied that he was 19, and he joined the British Army. He was then sent out to India, and when he arrived in India, he did the equivalent of a university subject with the army in Hindustani, so that he could speak perfect Hindustani, and then he did the equivalent of a university degree in engineering. And round about that time, the British were building their first major railway in Africa through Kenya over the Tsavo River. The workers there were half African and half Indian, indentured Indian labour, which had been transferred from India to Africa. And everything was on hold because every night lions were coming into the camp and eating the workers. The British Army decided what they need is a man who can speak Hindustani, because all the Africans have run away and gone home. There are only Indians there now. A man who can build a bridge and a railway over the Tsavo River, so he has to be an engineer, and a man who can shoot lions. And so they sent Patterson there, and he did all three very, very successfully. And then he wrote at a later date the book, The Man-Eaters of Tsavo, which became a bestseller. It was virtually never out of print for 50 years. And Jabotinsky is quoted as saying that whenever an Englishman goes abroad, he takes only 2 books with him, the Bible and The Man-Eaters of Tsavo. And in fact, when one of Allenby's underlings sent Patterson on what Patterson thought would be a disciplinary action to another officer in the British Army, the other officer, in fact, was very friendly with him and said, he said, you know, I can remember my little grandson, every time I was over to his place, or he stayed with me, he'd ask me to read another chapter of The Man-Eaters of Tsavo.
What an extraordinary skill set he had.
But look, the man's life is amazing. You know, that a man like this could be written out of history is just extraordinary. And it has been, as I said, a privilege to write this book and bring him back into the open, so to speak.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess every question, you know, the answers are so complex and so interesting. I think we're almost ready to call it a night. Over to you, Gavin.
I think Ian's going to do the vote of thanks. I think, according to my running sheet.
Yes, I've got that. Thank you. First, Henry, a most fascinating talk about an incredible person who did not deserve to be written out of history, and all power to you for having made sure that he's not written out of history, and may that continue so that his rightful place in both Israeli history and indeed in the history of warfare is properly accorded to him. So a very big toda rabah from all of us to you for that.
Thank you.
In thanking you, can I also remind people that the Lamm Jewish Library of Australia, as we call it, the premier resource centre in Australia for Judaica, will be having a copy of your book for borrowing. The library is now open again, back to its old self, but is COVID safe. But to ensure that the library remains open and that we can have the Historical Society and the Genealogical Society rooms there remaining, we need money. And we're having an appeal on Sunday to the community for funds because we've been short of funds as a result of this coronavirus. I've never heard of that thing before. So we ask people to both dig deep and if you've got a spare few minutes or a couple of hours, to get in touch with me because we are also very anxious to get people to man the phones. We've got the list, we'll help you, and we even provide food in a COVID-safe way. So, Henry, a very big thank you to you. May your writing skills continue. You've only, I think it's 8 books you're up to now. May that continue for many years, and may you get up to 18.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Harry, for an absolutely fabulous address. Those of us who've been brought up on Lawrence of Arabia and some of the interesting Arabists of the world will be fascinated by your topic tonight, and we'll obviously be looking to purchase and read Patterson of Israel. I think there's a long history of Arabists in English literature, including, I think, Kim Philby's father and a number of others. Patterson of Israel obviously is going to be well sought and well read, and I look forward to reading it with interest. As far as any other update goes, we've had, I think, 53 participants tonight, and there are more than 2 on some of them. So we're well over 60. We've been running on Zoom all year, as have most organisations, quite successfully. The Australian Jewish Historical Society's journal has recently been posted out to its members. Those of you who are not members are encouraged to join, because the journal is a first-rate production edited by Hilary Rubenstein and Howard Freeman, and the latest edition has plenty of fascinating reading in it. So once again, thank you very much indeed, Harry, for a fabulous evening, and thank you everyone for your participation.